I don't think Jonathan needs an introduction, and any time I spend doing that takes away time from a great presentation that he has for us. Then we'll have our break and go on with the second part of our program. So Jonathan, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's an honor for me to be with you here today, although sometimes I think I'm invited down to Florida because I'm the only New York lawyer you can find who's not also a member of the Florida Bar. But I'm just delighted to be here. Question is, how did we get here? And in fact, to understand that, you have to go back to the 2000 election with George Bush and Al Gore. And your state, Florida, was the determinant about who was going to be president of the United States. And there were fights, and it all went to the Supreme Court. And in the middle of December, I mean, you think about that. We had an election beginning of November, and in the middle of December, we finally find out that the Supreme Court is going to hand the crown to George Bush. And that day that the Supreme Court made its decision, George Bush went before all the TV cameras and said, you know, he was very gratified that the Supreme Court had, in fact, determined that he was going to be the president of the United States for at least the next 4 years. And he said, I'm going to be a domestic president. No foreign intervention, no foreign wars, no nation building. We know how that really worked out. But he said, because I'm going to be a domestic president, my #1 domestic agenda is the repeal of tax. Now, he's got a Republican Senate, a Republican House. It's the honeymoon period. We know it's going to happen. And I called my best lawyer friend, Mitch Gans, and I said, Mitchell, you and I are going to write an article about the impact of a state tax repeal. Because it's not just that the federal government is going to lose some revenue. There are other great ramifications, impact on states. In fact, Florida used to get about 3% of its total revenue from the state death tax credit, which obviously would be lost and in fact has been lost. And that's a big deal, 3%. In other states it was more, and also charities were going to be directly affected, because the higher the estate tax, the more that people will devote to charity. And if you have a 0 estate tax rate, it means you're not going to have that kind of charitable giving that you had before. Anyway, Mitchell and I wrote this article, which appeared in Tax Notes, which many of you have probably never even seen. And about a week later, I got a call, and it said, Mr. Blattmachr, this is the New York Times. And we found your esoteric article about the ramifications of estate tax repeals and Tax Notes. And we think your article is so profound that tomorrow morning on the front page of the New York Times, there's going to be an article about your article. And I said, is this my roommate from college? I mean, I knew this was, you know, this was a joke, but it turned out it was for real. By the way, 4 clients fired me. Even though Mitchell and I did not take a position that the estate tax should be kept, many of my clients felt it was, you know, going to be, that we were advocating the retention of the estate tax. In fact, I even got letters from fellows of the American College of Trust and Estates Council who said I brought shame on the college for writing that article. I mean, you can't make it up. It's absolutely true. Well, we know we didn't get immediate estate tax repeal, and the reason is because the Republicans decided that what was even more necessary than the repeal of the estate tax was to reduce the income taxes on wealthy people, because they knew that the poor had been engaging in class warfare, because they were making rich people pay income tax, and this was an anathema. So they went ahead and they, for example, I have a brother-in-law who makes $40,000 a year. He saved $300 a year from the George Bush tax cuts. I saved $50,000. But that's what George wanted. That's what the Republicans got through. But they did want to fulfill George's promise of estate tax repeal, but that was put off until 2010. By the way, you can blame me and hate me, or blame me and love me for it, but the reason we had the sunset provision was because I called Tom Daschle, who was then the head of the Democrats, and told him about the Byrd Rule. He did not know about the Byrd Rule. His staff didn't know about the Byrd Rule, which meant you could have the Bush tax cuts end after 10 years. And that was supposed to happen. But in 2010, we were supposed to get repeal of the estate tax. Now, everybody knew it would never happen. It was impossible. And I go around the country, and in fact, I write a computer program, as some of you know. Immediately, I put in some questions. Do you want to say what happens if there's no estate tax when this person dies? Because she's probably going to have formulas that tie into estate tax concepts, like the marital deduction, or the estate tax exemption, or the GST exemption. And so users of my system could say, yeah, it's probably not going to happen, but we'll put it in, and there'll be a paragraph or two of what happens if this impossible thing happens. So I went around the country telling people, and I was laughed at, and finally Mike Graham, who's my co-developer of my program, and I wrote an article for publication in Probate and Property, which is of course published by the American Bar Association, entitled Thinking About the Impossible for 2010. And the editor, this was in 2007, the editor came up with this cover for the magazine. You'll notice that there's a cow jumping over the moon, and we have pigs flying. And you can see way back here, you've got the devil sitting on a block of ice, which of course means hell has finally frozen over. And then on the front, we have this gentleman holding a newspaper, headline, no estate tax and carryover basis. You know what the back page says? Cubs win World Series. Now, this was especially funny, of course, because the ABA is in Chicago. So in any event, everybody knew it wasn't going to happen, but I used to think I was pretty good on forecasting political things. But last December, even I was just shocked when Mitch McConnell and John Kyle and Barack Obama, in a 2-hour meeting with no staff people, no technicians there, nobody else, not the head of the Senate Finance Committee, not the head of the Ways and Means Committee, they made a deal, and not one comma could be changed at all on that. And that brings us to kind of where we are today. Let me just see if I can get this thing going. Yeah, here we have. You know, this is what happened in 2010. You all know about it. And, but now we have this extraordinary thing. When I got out of law school, through 1976, the estate tax exemption was $60,000. The gift tax exemption was $30,000. By the way, compared to most countries at that time that had gift and estate tax systems or type systems, those were very, very generous exemptions. Our exemption now is $5 million. That's almost a 100 times increase. 100 times increase in the estate tax exemption and nearly a 200 times increase in the gift tax exemption. I never in my life thought I was going to see something like that. Now, as we know, it is temporary only. This is going to sunset at the end of next year, if not faster, and I'll talk about that in a moment, and we go back to $1 million, except the GST exemption will have been adjusted for inflation, and it'll be somewhere around $1,400,000, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later as well. Okay, Bill. Well, here, I'm going to do it by hand. At least we'll get it down that way. Now, there's a very, very strong case for using the gift tax and the GST exemption right now. One is kind of a moral, one is an observation, and the other is a problem that we're going to have in using it. So let's take a look at it. The moral is that you always want to use an exemption provided for in the law as early as possible. And one of the reasons is it may go away. It's now scheduled to go away at the end of 2012. Now, a lot of people say, oh no, they're going to keep it at the $5 million level. One of the things I don't think you're going to see is the gift tax exemption at the $5 million level. The reason is what Mitch and I pointed out in our article. The purpose of the gift tax is not just kind of to supplement the estate tax, but it's also to preserve the integrity of the income tax. Laird, for example, if she's about to make a big sale of some Microsoft stock, if there were no gift tax, she could give it to her daughter Alexandra, who's in a lower tax bracket. Alexandra sells it, pays a lower tax, and gives it back to her mom. Now, people say, oh, we can trace that stuff and see it happen. But the bottom line is, if Laird had to pay a gift tax at the time she gave that appreciated stock to her daughter, who would then sell it, and her daughter had to pay a gift tax being back, it's an inhibition on shifting income over to other people. And that's the principal reason that the gift tax is there, not just to supplement the estate tax. And in fact, we've seen it on the ACTEC listserv in the last 2 weeks. It must literally be 100 times people have done it. Clary Gottlieb, Steen & Hamilton, a great firm in New York City, even sent out a notice to his clients. We don't think this is going to happen, but there's enough rumor about it that maybe you want to make your $5 million transfer before November 23. Now, I don't think it's going to happen, but I know there are some lawyers who this week have been sending flyers out to their clients saying, we don't think it's going to happen, but anything can happen in politics, so maybe you better use it now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more, if you decide to use it, on the best structure. But the bottom line is, use an exemption as early as you possibly can. The other is an observation about the most important thing in the universe, which was an observation by Albert Einstein, and that is compounding. The most important thing in the universe is compounding. If you set aside $5 million today, and if you live for 30 years, and even if you only earn 3% a year after tax, it would grow from $5 million to $12 million. If you earn 6%, which historically is a very, very low return, it's about like a bond return, it's lower than an historic real estate return, it would grow to $29 million. And if you earn 10%, and except for the period of 1830 to 1860, in every 30-year period in America's history, we have had, on average in equities, more than a 10% return. So if you just took average stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, you would have about a 10% return over any 30-year period. And in that case, your $5 million would grow to $80 million, 16 times more than you started with. That's extraordinary. Now, one of the things you might say, though, is, but what about the income tax on those gains? You know, part of it may be dividends, and that's going to be taxed as ordinary income in the future, theoretically. It's going to be interest. It's going to be capital gain. It might be short-term capital gain, in other words, taxed. And that, of course, means that you're going to roll out one of the estate planner's very best friend, which is the grantor trust. Because we know with a grantor trust, the income goes to the trust, but the tax bill goes to the grantor, and that means from the perspective of the trust and its beneficiaries, the property is growing tax-free. And the most powerful thing in financial planning puts together Albert Einstein's dual observations. Number one, I told you about what's the most important thing in the universe? Compounding. The other thing that Albert Einstein observed was the hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax. So the corollary I derived is the most important thing in financial planning is tax-free compounding. When you make the transfer to the grantor trust, you find out that that is what you want because it can grow tax-free. Now, Diana Zadel and I and a guy named Robert Weiss, who now works for JP Morgan, did a study a number of years ago comparing GRATs to installment sales to grantor trust to direct gifts. And by the way, the installment sale to grantor trust won. But we went back and tried to discern what was the most powerful factor in removing these assets from the base of wealth transfer. It was grantor trust status. So it's the number one thing you can do for your clients. Blattmachr's number one rule, and there are virtually no exceptions to this rule, every transfer during lifetime or death is to a trust.